The air hung thick with the scent of lilies, a cloying sweetness that grated on Jiang Nian's nerves. The room, vast and shadowed despite the soft glow of lamps scattered across polished surfaces, felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped within the confines of her chest. Two men, their faces impassive and movements precise, flanked her. They hadn't spoken a word since bundling her into the car, the silence only amplifying her anxiety. She tried to focus on the intricate patterns woven into the rug beneath her worn shoes, anything to avoid the weight of the unseen gaze she could feel boring into her back. Just breathe, Nian Nian, she told herself, just breathe. This is about Nai Nai. Everything is about Nai Nai. The image of her grandmother's frail form, etched with worry lines and the pallor of illness, burned in her mind. It was that image, that fierce protective love, that had brought her here, to this opulent prison, to face a man she knew only through whispered rumors and veiled threats. He turned, finally, emerging from the shadows. Qin Xiao. His presence filled the room, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. He was younger than she'd imagined, his face a study in sharp angles and controlled power. His eyes, dark and fathomless, held a chilling intensity that made her shiver despite the warmth of the room. He studied her, a slow, deliberate appraisal that stripped away any pretense of polite conversation. Jiang Nian clenched her fists, the chipped nail polish a stark reminder of her own vulnerability. He looks at me like I'm a thing, she thought, the realization sending a wave of nausea through her. Not a person. A thing. Turn around and lift up your shirt, his voice, low and smooth as polished jade, sliced through the silence. The words, so stark and dehumanizing, hung in the air. Jiang Nian stiffened, her spine straightening with a defiance that surprised even her. Shame burned in her throat, hot and acrid. The lilies, once merely cloying, now seemed to mock her, their fragrance a suffocating reminder of her powerlessness. She could feel the men behind her shift, their silent pressure urging her to comply. But a cold, hard knot of anger had formed in her stomach, pushing back against the fear. He thinks he can just buy me. Like I'm some kind of commodity. The thought ignited a spark of rebellion within her. She wouldn't be bought. Not like this. Not ever. She met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a newfound strength. No, she said, the word a small, brittle sound in the vastness of the room, yet it resonated with an unexpected power. A flicker of surprise crossed Qin Zhao's face, quickly masked by an impassive calm. He tilted his head, studying her with a renewed intensity. For a long moment, the silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. Jiang Nian held her breath, bracing herself for his reaction. Forget it, he said finally, his voice devoid of any inflection. Let's go out. The words, so unexpected, left Jiang Nian reeling. She had anticipated anger, perhaps even violence. But this dismissal it felt worse somehow. It confirmed her deepest fears, solidified her status as nothing more than an object to be examined, discarded. He doesn't even care, she realized, the thought a bitter pill to swallow. He has so much power, can just move on to the next one. The weight of her grandmother's illness pressed down on her, crushing her fragile hope. What choice did she have? As they left the room, the scent of lilies clung to her like a shroud. The opulent surroundings, the expensive furnishings, the very air she breathed, all seemed to whisper of Qin Zhao's wealth and power. And her own desperate poverty. The car ride was a blur of city lights and silent tension. Jiang Nian stared out the window, the flashing neon signs painting fleeting, distorted images across her face. Her mind raced, grappling with the impossible situation she found herself in. What will I tell Nai Nai? The question echoed in her thoughts, a constant, throbbing ache. Back in the cramped, familiar confines of her grandmother's hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic replaced the cloying scent of lilies. The beeping of machines and the hushed murmurs of nurses were a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of Qin Zhao's world. Her grandmother, propped up against pillows, her face pale and drawn, reached for her hand. "Nian Nian," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with concern. "What happened? Where were you?" Jiang Nian forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing that threatened to shatter at any moment. "It's nothing, Nai Nai," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just a misunderstanding." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Her grandmother's eyes, though clouded with age and illness, held a wisdom that saw through her flimsy facade. "Don't lie to me, child," she said softly, her grip tightening on Jiang Nian's hand. "I know something is wrong." Jiang Nian's carefully constructed composure crumbled. She sank to her knees beside the bed, burying her face in her grandmother's thin blankets, the rough fabric a small comfort in the face of her overwhelming despair. "I don't know what to do, Nai Nai," she sobbed, the words muffled against the cloth. "I don't know what to do." Her grandmother stroked her hair, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Tell me everything, child," she whispered. "Tell me everything." And so, Jiang Nian, her voice choked with tears and her heart heavy with fear, poured out the whole story, the weight of Qin Zhao's offer, the humiliation of his examination, the crushing despair of her powerlessness. As she spoke, the sterile hospital room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, suffocating her with the reality of her situation. She was trapped, caught between her love for her grandmother and her own fierce independence, between the crushing weight of poverty and the chilling indifference of a man who held her fate in his hands. The chipped porcelain mug warmed Jiang Nian's hands, the faint scent of jasmine tea a fragile comfort against the gnawing unease in her stomach. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, skeletal shadows across the cramped room, exaggerating the cracks in the plaster walls. Outside, the city hummed with a distant, indifferent life, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness within their tiny apartment. She watched her grandmother, frail and small beneath the worn quilt, her breath shallow and uneven. Each inhale seemed a monumental effort, each exhale a whispered farewell. Guilt, sharp and stinging, pricked at Jiang Nian's conscience. 100 yuan a month. It was a sum that could ease their burdens, buy medicine, perhaps even afford a small heater for the winter. But the price, a purine body, she murmured, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She hadn't wanted to tell her grandmother, to burden her with the grotesque details of Mr. Zhao's proposition. But the silence, the weight of the secret, had become unbearable. "That's what he called it, Nai Nai." Her grandmother's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with confusion. "A pure what?" "Nian Nian, what are you talking about?" Jiang Nian hesitated, the mug trembling slightly in her hands. How could she explain the chillingly clinical way Mr. Zhao had assessed her, his gaze dissecting her like a specimen under a microscope? How could she convey the veiled threat lurking beneath his polished words, the unspoken implication that refusal wasn't truly an option? He's ill," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "A very rare illness. And he believes I can cure him." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, a bitter pill she forced herself to swallow. "He's offering compensation." "Compensation?" Her grandmother's brow furrowed, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. "What kind of compensation?" 100 yuan every month." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. Jiang Nian watched her grandmother's face, searching for understanding, for reassurance, for anything but the mixture of fear and hope she saw reflected there. 100 yuan, her grandmother repeated, her voice barely audible. It was a fortune to them, a lifeline in a sea of despair. Jiang Nian knew what she was thinking, the calculations already forming in her weary mind. The cost of medicine, the overdue rent, the gnawing hunger that never seemed to abate. Nai, Jiang Nian pleaded, her voice laced with desperation. It's not right. He wants something unnatural. She couldn't bring herself to say the words, to articulate the chilling reality of Mr. Zhao's proposition. The thought of it made her skin crawl, a visceral revulsion that twisted her stomach into knots. Her grandmother reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against Jiang Nian's cheek. The touch, once firm and comforting, was now feather-light, almost ethereal. Nian, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Do you understand what this money could mean for us? I can get the medicine I need. You can continue your studies. Jiang Nian closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She knew her grandmother was right, that the money was a lifeline they desperately needed. But the thought of selling herself, of becoming a living cure for a man she barely knew, filled her with a deep, bone-chilling dread. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of everything she held dear. But what about my future, Nai, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. What about my dreams? She had worked so hard, sacrificing everything to get into Jiangqing University. Was she supposed to throw it all away, to sacrifice her future for a handful of yuan? Her grandmother's hand tightened on her cheek, her grip surprisingly strong. Your future lies in ensuring my survival, Nian. Without me, what do you have? The words, though spoken with love, felt like a shackle, binding her to a fate she didn't want. The silence returned, heavier this time, pregnant with unspoken anxieties and fears. Jiang Nian stared at the chipped mug in her hands, the jasmine tea now cold and bitter. The steam had long since dissipated, leaving behind only a lingering scent, a ghostly reminder of a warmth she no longer felt. 100 yuan. It was a paltry sum, a pittance compared to the price she was being asked to pay. But it was also everything. It was the difference between life and death, between hope and despair. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate her. She looked at her grandmother, her frail body barely visible beneath the worn quilt, and knew she had no choice. She would do whatever it took to save her, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams, her own future. Even if it meant becoming a prisoner in a gilded cage, a living cure for a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. The bitter taste of resignation coated her tongue, a prelude to the sacrifices yet to come. The hum of the city outside seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the life she was being forced to leave behind. 100 yuan. It was a price she couldn't afford, yet one she couldn't refuse. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clung to Jiang Nian like a second skin. She sat rigidly on the plastic chair, the chill seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor beside her grandmother's bed was a relentless hammer against her composure. Her knuckles were white against the worn leather of her handbag, a testament to the tension coiling in her stomach. How could things unravel so quickly? She thought, her gaze fixed on the frail form beneath the crisp white sheets. Just last week, her grandmother had been tending her small herb garden, her laughter ringing out like wind chimes in the gentle breeze. Now, her face was ashen, etched with lines of pain she tried valiantly to conceal. Nian, her grandmother's voice was a mere whisper, thin and reedy, like dried leaves skittering across pavement. Jiang Nian leaned closer, her heart clenching with each shallow breath her grandmother took. I'm here, Nai, she murmured, forcing a reassuring smile she didn't feel. Don't worry, she willed her voice to sound stronger, we'll find a way. But the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Her grandmother's hand, papery and thin, reached out and grasped hers. The touch, once firm and comforting, now felt fragile, like a bird's wing. The doctor spoke to me, she said, her voice strained. Each word seemed to cost her immense effort. Jiang Nian's stomach plummeted. The doctor's evasive answers earlier had done little to quell the rising tide of fear within her. She had seen the grave expression on his face, the pity in his eyes. "What did he say, Nai?" she asked, dreading the answer yet needing to know. Her grandmother's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a weariness that pierced Jiang Nian to the core. "My heart," she began, then paused, a flicker of pain crossing her features. "It's not strong anymore." Her voice trailed off, lost in the sterile hum of the hospital room. Jiang Nian's throat constricted, making it difficult to speak. Not strong anymore. What did that even mean? The vague words echoed in her mind, each syllable a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to rail against the unfairness of it all. But looking at her grandmother's frail form, she forced herself to remain calm. He mentioned a surgery, her grandmother continued, her gaze drifting towards the ceiling, as if searching for answers in the stark white tiles. A complicated one. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Expensive. Jiang Nian knew, with a sickening certainty, what her grandmother hadn't said. Their meager savings had already been depleted, swallowed whole by the mounting medical bills. The thought of the astronomical cost of such a surgery sent a wave of despair crashing over her. Where would they find the money? How could she, a struggling student barely making ends meet, possibly afford to save her grandmother's life? "Don't worry, Nai," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. The lie felt even heavier now, a lead weight in her stomach. We'll figure something out." Her grandmother's hand tightened around hers, a silent plea in her grip. Nian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, I don't want to be a burden." Jiang Nian's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "Don't say that, Nai," she choked out, squeezing her grandmother's hand. "You're not a burden. You're everything to me." A heavy silence settled between them, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the sterile walls in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of the dying light seemed to mock the despair that filled the small room. Finally, her grandmother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor, he said there's not much time." The words hit Jiang Nian like a physical blow. Time. The one thing she couldn't buy, couldn't borrow, couldn't steal. She felt a cold dread creeping into her bones, a chilling premonition of a future without her grandmother's warm smile, her gentle touch, her soothing voice. The thought was unbearable. How much time?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Her grandmother's eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation, met hers. "A few months, maybe less," the words hung in the air, heavy with finality. A few months. The time frame seemed both an eternity and a mere blink of an eye. Jiang Nian closed her eyes, trying to block out the despair that threatened to consume her. She had to be strong. She had to find a way. For her grandmother. For the woman who had sacrificed everything for her, who had been her rock, her anchor, her everything. Opening her eyes, she forced a smile, a pale imitation of the genuine warmth she usually felt. "Don't worry, Nai," she said, her voice laced with a newfound determination. "I'll find a way. I promise." Deep inside, a frantic voice screamed. "But how? How?" The question echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart, a chilling reminder of the insurmountable odds stacked against her. The weight of her grandmother's life rested squarely on her young shoulders, a crushing burden that threatened to break her. But she couldn't break. She wouldn't. She had to find a way. Even if it meant selling her soul to the devil. The opulent suite, bathed in the muted glow of evening city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, felt like a gilded cage. Qin Shao paced, the Persian rug muffling the sound of his restless steps. He'd offered her a fortune, enough to erase her grandmother's debts and secure her future. Yet, she refused. Her stubbornness, her unwavering gaze, it was unsettling. He wasn't accustomed to being denied. His world operated on a simple principle: money solved everything. Except, it seemed, this. He stopped by the window, the glittering cityscape a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He could feel the insidious creep of his illness, a constant hum beneath the surface of his carefully constructed composure. Time was a luxury he could no longer afford. A soft knock on the door announced her arrival. He schooled his features into a mask of calm authority, the mask he wore for the world. When he opened the door, Jiang Yan stood there, her small frame radiating a quiet strength that belied her circumstances. He gestured her in, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. He poured 2 glasses of wine, the crystal catching the light like trapped stars. He offered her one, but she shook her head, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in his glass. "Miss Jiang," he began, his voice low and controlled, "I understand your hesitation. Let me assure you, my intentions are honorable." He knew how hollow those words sounded, even to his own ears. Honor had little to do with this. Survival did. Her silence was more damning than any outright accusation. He took a sip of wine, the rich, complex flavor doing little to soothe the gnawing anxiety within him. "I haven't been entirely forthcoming with you," he admitted, his gaze meeting hers. He saw the flicker of apprehension in her eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw. "Good. Let her be afraid." Fear was a powerful motivator. "There's a condition," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "a rather unique one. My body, it possesses an excess of yang energy. It requires balance. A counterpoint." He paused, watching her closely. She remained silent, her expression unreadable. He could almost hear the whirring of her thoughts behind those dark, intelligent eyes. He pressed on, "You, Miss Jiang, possess a particular constitution. A purine body. It's rare. Essential, in fact, for my recovery." The air in the room crackled with the unspoken truth. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, followed by a wave of revulsion. He braced himself for the inevitable outburst, the righteous indignation. But it didn't come. She simply stood there, her silence heavy with a mixture of fear and disgust. He took another sip of wine, the taste turning to ash in his mouth. He hated this. He hated the desperation that clawed at him, the vulnerability that he was forced to expose. He, Qin Shao, who controlled empires, was reduced to begging. "I'm offering you a solution, Miss Jiang," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "A mutually beneficial arrangement. Your grandmother receives the best medical care. Your future is secured. And I survive." He laid it out bare, the stark reality of their intertwined fates. Jiang Yan finally spoke, her voice low and steady, a tremor of barely contained anger vibrating through her words. "You're asking me to sell myself to you? For my grandmother's health?" Her eyes blazed, twin embers burning into him. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He hated the way she framed it, the disgust evident in her tone. But he couldn't deny the truth in her words. "It's not like that," he began, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. He saw the disbelief in her eyes, the subtle curl of her lip. He knew he was losing her, losing this opportunity. "Then what is it, Mr. Shao?" she challenged, her voice laced with icy contempt. "A philanthropic endeavor? A selfless act of charity?" He clenched his jaw, fighting to maintain his composure. He had to make her understand. He had to make her see that this wasn't about desire, about taking advantage. This was about survival. His survival. It's a necessity, he said, his voice raw with desperation. A matter of life and death. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. My life, Miss Jiang. Hanging in the balance. Jiang Nian took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her chest, a protective gesture. The revulsion in her eyes intensified. And my life, Mr. Xiao, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. What about my dignity? My self-respect? He saw the tears welling up in her eyes, but there was no yielding in her gaze. Her defiance, her refusal to be broken, it was unexpected. He'd expected tears, pleading, perhaps even a grudging acceptance. But not this. Not this unwavering strength. A strange feeling twisted in his gut. Not desire, not the cold calculation he'd expected. Something else. Respect? Admiration? He couldn't quite name it. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his illness, the desperation, pressing down on him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a means to an end, but a woman. A young woman, burdened by circumstances beyond her control, fiercely protective of her own integrity. He saw her strength, her resilience, and for the first time since his diagnosis, a flicker of something other than fear ignited within him. Hope. Perhaps. Or maybe just the faintest glimmer of humanity in the face of his own consuming need. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of his burden. He stepped back, giving her the space she so clearly craved. Perhaps, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, there's another way. He turned away, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights, the glittering promise of a future he wasn't sure he'd see. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. The crisp autumn air vibrated with the nervous energy of 1,000 new beginnings. Jiang Nian stood among the sea of freshmen at Jiangqing University, the crimson banner proclaiming the commencement ceremony a stark contrast to the muted grays and blues of the student uniforms. The scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the faint, metallic tang of the bleachers, a strange, almost dizzying combination that mirrored the turmoil within her. Just a week ago, she'd been resigned to abandoning her dreams, the weight of her grandmother's medical bills a crushing burden. Now, here she was, amidst the hopeful faces of her peers, a recipient of a full scholarship, a miracle she couldn't quite comprehend. The university president's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, his words a blur of platitudes about hard work and opportunity. Jiang Nian's gaze drifted towards the towering clock tower, its shadow stretching long and thin across the manicured lawn. A full scholarship, the phrase echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the celebratory symphony of the day. Gratitude warred with a deep-seated unease. Who was this anonymous benefactor? What were their motives? The questions gnawed at her, a persistent itch beneath her skin. The president's voice sharpened, cutting through her reverie. He was announcing the name of the benefactor, a name that sent a jolt of icy fear through her veins. Qin Xiao. Mr. Xiao. The man who'd offered her a deal that chilled her to the bone, a deal she'd vehemently refused. The man who'd spoken of ancient remedies and a desperate need she couldn't fathom. He was here. Her hand instinctively flew to her wrist, tracing the faint outline of the birthmark hidden beneath her sleeve. A birthmark he'd known about, a birthmark that had become a mark of both vulnerability and fear. The applause around her seemed to rise in volume, a deafening roar that threatened to swallow her whole. He's here. He did this. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The scholarship, her grandmother's sudden recovery, the seemingly impossible ease with which her life had been rearranged, it all pointed to him. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She felt a sudden urge to flee, to disappear back into the anonymity of her former life, a life where her biggest worry was making ends meet, not deciphering the motives of a powerful, enigmatic man. Her grandmother's frail but hopeful face flashed before her eyes. The relief in her voice when the doctors declared her condition stable, the joy in her eyes when Jiang Nian received her acceptance letter. Could she throw it all away? Could she risk her grandmother's health, her future, on a principle, on a fear she couldn't even articulate? The ceremony concluded, the crowd dispersing in a flurry of excited chatter. Jiang Nian remained rooted to the spot, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The initial euphoria of being at Jiangcheng, the culmination of years of hard work, was now tainted by a chilling uncertainty. What did Qin Xiao want from her? The answer, she feared, was far more complex than a simple act of philanthropy. She felt a presence beside her, a shadow falling over her. Slowly, she turned to face him. Qin Xiao stood there, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. The sunlight glinted off his glasses, obscuring his eyes, making him seem even more remote, more intimidating. He didn't speak, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, with a tension that crackled in the air. Jiang Nian's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat, choked by a fear that was both visceral and inexplicable. He'd orchestrated this entire charade, woven a web of generosity and obligation around her, and she was trapped in its silken threads. She could feel his gaze on her, a tangible weight that made her skin crawl. He knew. He knew the turmoil raging within her, the questions tearing at her soul. He finally spoke, his voice low and smooth, a stark contrast to the inner chaos he evoked. "Congratulations, Miss Jiang. I trust you're pleased with your scholarship." The words were polite, almost cordial, yet they carried an undercurrent of something darker, something that sent shivers down her spine. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Why?" she managed to whisper, the word barely audible above the receding murmur of the crowd. A faint smile played on his lips. "Why not? Consider it an investment. In your future, in our future." The ambiguity of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Our future. The phrase reverberated in her mind, a chilling premonition of a future she didn't want, a future she couldn't control. Her fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that threatened to consume her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He took a step closer, the subtle shift in his posture radiating an almost predatory grace. "You will," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers, holding her captive in his silent scrutiny. "In time, you will understand everything." He paused, his eyes flickering down to her wrist, to the hidden mark that bound them together in this strange, unsettling dance. "For now, simply enjoy your success, Miss Jiang. You've earned it." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the dispersing crowd, leaving Jiang Yin standing alone, bathed in the unsettling afterglow of his presence. The celebratory atmosphere of the day felt miles away, a distant echo in a world that had suddenly become sharp, dangerous, and utterly unpredictable. She looked down at her hand, still clenched tight, the faint crescent of her fingernails imprinted on her palm, a small, physical reminder of the invisible chains that now bound her to a man she barely knew, a man whose motives remained shrouded in a chilling, impenetrable mystery. The weight of his unspoken expectations pressed down on her, heavier than any debt, heavier than any fear she'd ever known. The future she'd dreamt of, the future she'd fought for, now seemed like a fragile illusion, a mirage shimmering on the horizon of a vast, unknown landscape. The opulent silence of Qin Zhao's private study pressed down on Jiang Yin. The air, thick with the scent of aged sandalwood and leather-bound books, felt suffocating. Outside, The remnants of the celebratory fireworks from the earlier ceremony still crackled faintly, a mocking counterpoint to the tension simmering within the room. She stood rigidly, clutching her worn handbag, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath her feet. Every fiber of her being screamed to escape this gilded cage, this man who held her fate in his hands. He sat behind a vast mahogany desk, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating his sharp features. He seemed a creature of the shadows, his power palpable, a stark contrast to her own vulnerability. He thinks money can buy anything, she thought bitterly, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. He thinks I'm like the others. Qin Shao watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. He had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even a calculated show of gratitude. Instead, he was met with this defiance. He had offered her a sum that would erase her grandmother's medical debts, a sum that would change her life forever. And yet, she stood there, unyielding. He found it intriguing. A flicker of something akin to respect, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, sparked within him. She's different. The thought echoed in his mind, a surprising counterpoint to his usual calculated pragmatism. He steepled his fingers, the cool jade of his ring pressing against his skin, a subtle reminder of his power, his control. Miss Jiang, he began, his voice low and controlled, I understand this is a difficult situation. Jiang Nian's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. Difficult, she echoed, her voice laced with a bitterness she hadn't intended to reveal. Difficult doesn't even begin to describe it, Mr. Shao. You dangle a lifeline in front of me, a lifeline attached to a price I'm not willing to pay. You think my dignity, my body, is something you can simply purchase? Her breath hitched in her throat, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. He doesn't see me. He sees a means to an end. The realization stung, a cold slap of reality against her already frayed nerves. A muscle twitched in Qin Zhao's jaw. He had expected resistance, but not this raw, untamed fury. It was unsettling, yet strangely captivating. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The subtle tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders were squared in defiance, the fire that burned in her eyes. He had underestimated her. Miss Jiang, he said, his voice softening slightly, a calculated tactic to disarm her, let's be reasonable. I'm offering you a solution to your problems. A chance for a better life, for your grandmother's well-being. A solution? Jiang Nian's voice dripped with scorn. You call this a solution? Trading my life, my future, for a handful of money? That's not a solution, Mr. Shao. That's a prison. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She longed to flee, to escape his suffocating presence, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. He won't understand. He can't understand. The thought echoed in her mind, a hollow refrain of despair. Qin Zhao's gaze hardened. This wasn't going as planned. He had anticipated a swift transaction, a clean exchange of money for services. But this woman, she was proving to be a formidable opponent. Miss Jiang, he said, his voice regaining its steely edge, you're not seeing the bigger picture. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement. Beneficial? Jiang Nian laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Beneficial for whom, Mr. Shao? Certainly not for me. Her voice cracked slightly, the strain of the situation beginning to take its toll. He's not listening. He's not even trying to understand. The realization settled upon her, a heavy weight of disappointment. Qin Shao rose from his chair, his tall frame towering over her. He circled the desk, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. Jiang Nian instinctively took a step back, her body tensing. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze piercing. Miss Jiang, he said, his voice low and intense, I need you to understand something. This isn't a negotiation. This is a necessity. He paused, his eyes searching hers. My life depends on it. The raw vulnerability in his voice, the flicker of desperation in his eyes, caught Jiang Yan off guard. For the first time, she saw beyond the wealth, the power, the ruthless pragmatism. She saw a man fighting for his survival, a man trapped in his own gilded cage. The realization, while not excusing his actions, shifted something within her. The anger, the defiance, remained, but a flicker of empathy began to bloom in its place. He's desperate, she realized, a strange mix of pity and fear swirling within her. But at what cost, she whispered, the question hanging heavy in the air, directed as much at herself as at him. Qin Shao saw the shift in her expression, the subtle softening of her eyes. He had shown her his vulnerability, a calculated risk, and it seemed to have paid off. He took another step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Jiang, he said, his gaze holding hers, I'm not asking you to give up your life. I'm asking you to help me save mine. He paused, his words hanging heavy in the air. And I am willing to discuss terms that are acceptable to you. The silence stretched, filled only with the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant echoes of the city. Jiang Yan's mind raced, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, desperation, and a newfound, unsettling understanding. She had come here prepared to fight, to resist, to protect her dignity at all costs. But now, faced with the raw vulnerability of the man before her, the lines blurred, the boundaries shifted. She looked at him, her gaze searching his, and saw not a monster, but a man trapped in his own desperate circumstances. Acceptable terms, she echoed, her voice barely a whisper, the seeds of a different kind of negotiation, a different kind of understanding, beginning to take root. The antiseptic scent of the hospital room pressed down on Jiang Yan, a stark contrast to the damp, musty odor of her grandmother's small apartment that clung to her clothes like a second skin. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the crisp white sheets and the frail figure nestled within them. Her grandmother, her face etched with lines of worry and recent pain, looked smaller than Jiang Yan remembered, swallowed by the oversized hospital bed. A knot tightened in Jiang Yan's chest. Guilt, sharp and insistent, pricked at her. Guilt for her powerlessness, guilt for the sacrifices her grandmother had made, guilt for the desperate bargain she was contemplating. Jiang Yan adjusted the phone precariously balanced on the bedside table, ensuring her grandmother had a clear view of the screen. The incoming video call ringtone jangled, a discordant sound in the quiet room. Qin Zhao's face appeared, a stark image of health and wealth against the backdrop of what Jiang Yan assumed was his opulent study. He looked directly at Jiang Yan, his gaze intense, unsettling. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his features. Was it concern? Impatience? Jiang Yan couldn't decipher it, and the uncertainty further fueled her anxiety. Grandma, Jiang Yan said softly, her voice catching in her throat. She pushed down the rising tide of resentment she felt towards Qin Shao, focusing on her grandmother's fragile smile. Nian Nian, her grandmother's voice was weak, but her eyes held a spark of something akin to excitement. Mr. Shao has been so kind. She paused, her gaze shifting to Qin Shao on the screen, a delicate flush creeping up her wrinkled neck, that he has taken care of everything. Jiang Yan's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Taken care of what, Grandma? Her grandmother's hand, papery thin, reached out and grasped Jiang Yan's. The warmth of the touch, despite its fragility, was grounding. The surgery, Nian Nian. Mr. Shao paid for it all. He ensured I had the best doctor, the best care. The words hit Jiang Yan like a physical blow. The air thickened in her lungs, making it hard to breathe. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the ruthless, demanding Qin Shao with this act of unexpected generosity. It felt like a calculated move, a subtle manipulation, a tightening of the invisible chains that were slowly binding her to him. A cold dread spread through her veins. Qin Xiao remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on her, seemingly gauging her reaction. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and simmering tensions. Jiang Nian could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, calculating his next move in this intricate game he was playing. "Mr. Xiao," Jiang Nian finally managed, her voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. I don't know what to say." A faint smile played on Qin Xiao's lips, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There is nothing to say, Miss Jiang. Your grandmother's health is important." His voice was smooth, controlled, devoid of any discernible emotion. Yet, beneath the polished veneer, Jiang Nian sensed a current of something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp. Was it genuine concern for her grandmother, or simply a strategic move to secure her compliance? Her grandmother squeezed her hand, her eyes filled with a pleading warmth. "Nian Nian, Mr. Xiao has been a godsend. We must find a way to repay him." The weight of her grandmother's words settled heavily on Jiang Nian's shoulders. She looked at her grandmother, the lines of worry etched deeper now, a reflection of her own internal turmoil. The unspoken expectation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Jiang Nian felt trapped, caught in a web of obligation and desperation. Her mind raced, frantically searching for an escape route, a way to navigate this treacherous terrain without sacrificing her own principles. She had drawn a line in the sand, a boundary she swore she wouldn't cross. But now, faced with the reality of her grandmother's gratitude and the undeniable weight of Qin Zhao's generosity, the lines seemed to blur, the sand shifting beneath her feet. The silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, a steady pulse against the chaotic storm raging within her. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the conflicting emotions, the overwhelming pressure. How could she reconcile her fierce independence with the undeniable debt she now owed? Opening her eyes, she met Qin Zhao's gaze, a silent conversation passing between them. She saw the unwavering resolve in his eyes, the quiet confidence of a man who held all the cards. And in that moment, Jiang Nian knew. She knew that the path ahead was fraught with danger, with uncertainty, with a profound sense of unease. But she also knew that she had no choice. For her grandmother, she would have to face the storm, even if it meant losing herself in the process. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to the silent battle raging within. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the inevitable. The fight had just begun. The scent of sandalwood hung heavy in the air, a fragile shield against the creeping chill of the temple. Jiang Nian traced the worn grooves in the wooden floor with her gaze, each step echoing in the vast, silent space. The flickering candlelight painted dancing shadows on the ancient murals, their stories whispering secrets of centuries past. A knot tightened in her stomach, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temple's chill and everything to do with the weight of her decision. 100 million yuan. A sum so astronomical it felt unreal, a figment of a desperate dream. Could she truly sell herself? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a visceral rejection of the very idea. But her grandmother, her frail hand clutching Jiang Nian's, her whispered pleas for help, those were real. Painfully real. The chanting started softly, a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into her bones. Master Wu, his eyes closed, sat cross-legged before the altar, his weathered face serene. Jiang Nian felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, in this sacred space, she could find a solution that wouldn't cost her everything. Master Wu, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I have a problem. The words felt inadequate, hollow in the face of the immense pressure she felt. The chanting stopped. Master Wu opened his eyes, his gaze clear and penetrating. Speak, child. The story tumbled out of her, a jumbled mess of fear and desperation. Qin Xiao, the illness, the impossible request, the exorbitant offer. With every word, the shame burned hotter, a brand on her soul. She hadn't told anyone the full truth, not even her grandmother. The thought of her grandmother knowing the true price of her potential salvation was unbearable. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the incense sticks. Jiang Yin waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was her last hope, a desperate gamble in a game she didn't understand. Finally, Master Wu spoke, his voice low and resonant. This Qin Xiao, he seeks to harness your life force, your yin essence, to replenish his own. A dangerous path, fraught with peril for both of you. Jiang Yan's breath hitched. His words confirmed her worst fears, solidifying the unease that had been gnawing at her. Is there a way?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A way to save her grandmother, to save herself, without becoming a vessel. Master Wu considered her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. There is a ritual, he said slowly, an ancient rite that allows for the transfer of energy without the complete surrender you fear. Hope flared in Jiang Yan's chest, a fragile flame against the darkness. "Tell me," she pleaded. "Please, tell me what I must do." He explained the intricate details, the specific herbs, the precise timing, the meditative chants. It was complex, demanding, but crucially, it maintained a barrier, a protection for her own life force. It would allow her to help Qin Xiao without losing herself in the process. But, Master Wu warned, this ritual requires absolute precision. Any deviation, any hesitation, could have dire consequences. Are you certain you are ready to undertake such a burden? Jiang Yan's mind raced. 100 million yuan. Her grandmother's life. Her own future. The weight of these burdens pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. But within that suffocating pressure, a new resolve solidified. She would not break. She would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect herself and her grandmother, even if it meant walking through fire. "I am ready," she said, her voice firm, the tremor gone. The fear remained, a cold knot in her gut, but it was now tempered with a steely determination. Leaving the temple, the night air felt different. The oppressive weight hadn't lifted entirely, but it felt manageable. The deal was struck. She would help Qin Xiao, but on her terms. She would use his money to save her grandmother, to secure her future, and she would do it without sacrificing her dignity, herself. The 100 million yuan was not a price for her, it was a weapon. A weapon she would wield to protect the things she held most dear. The image of Qin Xiao's face flashed in her mind, a mixture of arrogance and desperation. He thought he had bought her. He had no idea what he was truly dealing with. A faint smile touched her lips. He would learn. The journey back to the hospital was filled with a strange sense of calm. The fear still lingered, but now it was accompanied by a quiet strength, a newfound sense of control. She had faced the abyss and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. As she entered her grandmother's room, the familiar scent of antiseptic filled the air. Her grandmother was asleep, her breathing shallow but even. Jiang Yan sat by her bedside, watching her face, a profound sense of purpose settling over her. She would fight. For her grandmother, for herself, for a future free from the shadow of desperation. The 100 million yuan was not a price, it was a beginning. And Jiang Yan was ready to write the next chapter. The midday sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the Jiangxin University Gymnasium, the rhythmic thump of pop music vibrating through the air. Streamers of vibrant colors crisscrossed the high ceiling, a stark contrast to the nervous anticipation etched on the faces of the freshmen gathered for their first university dance. Jiang Yan wasn't there. Her absence was a ripple in the carefully choreographed chaos, a missing piece in the social puzzle that everyone seemed to be acutely aware of. Whispers, like tiny venomous snakes, slithered through the crowd. "Where is Jiang Nian?" someone asked, their voice laced with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. Li Wei, a girl from Jiang Nian's dormitory, shrugged, a carefully constructed mask of nonchalance plastered on her face. "Probably studying," she replied, her tone dripping with a saccharine sweetness that betrayed the underlying bitterness. "She's not exactly the dancing type, is she?" Internally, Li Wei seethed. Jiang Nian, with her quiet dignity and sharp intelligence, had become an unwitting target. Her refusal to participate in the petty social games, her focus on her studies and her grandmother's health, was perceived as a silent rebuke to the frivolous concerns of her peers. It made them uncomfortable, this stark reminder of a different world, a world of struggles they could barely comprehend. Across the room, Zhao Chang shifted uneasily from foot to foot. He had planned to ask Jiang Nian to dance, a small act of defiance against the unspoken social hierarchy that had already begun to solidify. He admired her quiet strength, the way she carried herself with an almost regal bearing despite her threadbare clothes. He knew, with a sinking heart, that his courage had failed him. He had let the whispers, the subtle pressure of his friends, erode his resolve. Now, watching the empty space where she should have been, he felt a pang of regret, a sense of lost opportunity that settled like a stone in his stomach. The music shifted, a slow, melancholic melody replacing the upbeat tempo. Couples began to pair off, their movements clumsy and hesitant, mirroring the awkwardness of their nascent relationships. The air thickened with a mixture of perfume, sweat, and nervous energy. Then, a hush fell over the room. At the entrance stood Qin Xiao. He was dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, the dark fabric a stark contrast to the casual attire of the students. His presence radiated power, an aura of command that silenced the music and stilled the dancers in mid-step. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room, settling on the empty space where Jiang Nian should have been. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features, quickly masked by a carefully composed expression. He had expected her to be here. He had made arrangements, pulled strings, ensured that her grandmother's medical bills were taken care of, all in anticipation of this moment. He needed her compliance, her cooperation, for his own survival. He walked towards Li Wei, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. "Where is Jiang Nian?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, a barely contained undercurrent of steel beneath the smooth surface. Li Wei stammered, her carefully constructed composure crumbling under the intensity of his gaze. I don't know, Mr. Xiao. She didn't say." Qin Xiao's eyes narrowed. He knew she was lying. He could smell the fear on her, taste the desperation in her hastily constructed excuses. But he had no time for games. His life was hanging in the balance, and every wasted moment brought him closer to the precipice. He turned and walked towards the university's administrative office. He needed to find her, and he needed to find her now. His own internal monologue raged. This girl, this Jiang Nian, held his life in her hands. He despised the feeling of powerlessness, the desperate need that gnawed at him. He was used to control, to bending the world to his will. But in this, the most crucial battle of his life, he was at the mercy of a young woman who seemed determined to defy him at every turn. He found her in the university library, hunched over a textbook, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sunlight streaming through the high windows illuminated the fine hairs on her neck, the delicate curve of her cheek. For a moment, he simply watched her, a strange mix of frustration and fascination swirling within him. She was so different from the women he usually encountered, so untouched by the trappings of wealth and power. He could sense a strength in her, a resilience that both intrigued and infuriated him. He cleared his throat, and she looked up, her eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in suspicion. "Mr. Xiao," she said, her voice cool and distant. "What are you doing here?" "I came to dance," he replied, extending his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Jiang?" Her mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of confusion, fear, and resentment. She knew what he wanted, what he expected. He had bought her cooperation, paid for her grandmother's treatment, and now he was here to collect his due. The thought made her stomach churn. She wanted to refuse, to tell him to go to hell, but the image of her grandmother, frail and vulnerable, flashed before her eyes. She had made a deal, a bargain with the devil, and now she had to pay the price. She looked at his outstretched hand, the elegant lines of his fingers, the expensive watch glinting on his wrist. It was a symbol of his power, his control over her life. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, steeling herself. Then, she took his hand. "All right, Mr. Xiao," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's dance." As they walked towards the gymnasium, the whispers started again, this time laced with a different kind of venom, the venom of envy and speculation. Qin Xiao, the untouchable, the enigmatic figure of power, had chosen Jiang Nian, the poor, scholarship student. The social hierarchy of Jiangqing University had just been irrevocably shaken. And Jiang Nian, caught in the eye of the storm, felt a cold dread settle in her heart. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this dance was just the beginning. The antiseptic scent of the hospital clung to Jiang Nian like a shroud. Her grandmother's shallow breaths, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, formed the dissonant symphony in the otherwise sterile room. 3 days. 3 days since the dance, 3 days since the chilling proposition, 3 days of her life dissolving into a relentless cycle of worry and dread. Mr. Zhao's emissary, a man with eyes as cold and sharp as shards of glass, had visited twice, each time his words a thinly veiled threat laced with promises of unimaginable wealth. Her grandmother's mounting medical bills formed a tangible weight in her chest, a constant reminder of her powerlessness. A shadow fell across the doorway. Jiang Nian turned to see Mr. Xiao, his face even paler than she remembered, a faint tremor in his hand as he gripped the doorframe. He looked fragile. The air of invincibility she'd sensed at the dance had eroded, replaced by something akin to desperation. A strange flicker of sympathy, unwelcome and confusing, warmed her insides. She quickly pushed it down, reminding herself of the impossible situation he'd placed her in. "How is she?" His voice was low, roughened, each word seeming to cost him an immense effort. "Stable," Jiang Nian replied, her tone clipped. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not to this man who held her future, her grandmother's life, in his elegant, trembling hands. She knew what he wanted, the reason for his visits. It was a silent battle waged in the sterile confines of the hospital room, the air thick with unspoken demands and resentful compliance. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the sleeping form on the bed. "The doctors?" "They say she needs another surgery," Jiang Nian responded, her voice barely above a whisper. Each word felt like a small betrayal, each syllable a chipping away at the last vestiges of her pride. He closed his eyes, a deep crease forming between his brows. "It will be arranged." The statement wasn't a question, but a decree. The weight of his wealth, his power, pressed down on her, suffocating. Days blurred into nights. The hospital room became her world, the rhythmic beeping of machines her constant companion. Mr. Zhao's presence became a fixture, a silent specter haunting the periphery. He would sit for hours, watching her grandmother, his gaze distant, his thoughts a mystery. Jiang Nian found herself studying him, searching for a clue, a hint of the man beneath the mask of wealth and power. She saw vulnerability in the tightness of his jaw, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. And yet, there was a steeliness in his gaze, an unwavering resolve that both terrified and intrigued her. The whispers started. Servants moving with hushed urgency, hushed phone calls taken in the hallway. The atmosphere in Mr. Zhao's opulent home, where she now resided under the guise of a companion for his ailing mother, crackled with a nervous energy. His birthday. His 30th birthday. A date, she learned from the furtive whispers, shrouded in superstition and fear within the Qin family. A date that held a significance far beyond the simple marking of another year. He remained secluded in his study, the heavy oak door a barrier against the world. Jiang Nian felt a strange compulsion to reach out, to bridge the chasm of fear and uncertainty that separated them. Perhaps it was the shared burden of their predicament, the unspoken understanding of the life-altering decision that hung heavy in the air. Perhaps it was the flicker of humanity she'd glimpsed beneath his carefully constructed facade. On the eve of his birthday, she stood outside his study, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knocked softly, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence of the house. He opened the door, his eyes shadowed, his face etched with fatigue. He looked older, the weight of the past 30 years pressing down on him with crushing force. "Mr. Xiao," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I know tomorrow is important." He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. He didn't speak, but the silence was an invitation. She took a deep breath. "I know about the significance of your birthday." The words felt heavy, laden with meaning she couldn't fully comprehend. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a weary resignation. "It's nothing," he murmured, turning away. "It's not nothing," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "The staff they're afraid." "You're afraid." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "It's a foolish superstition," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A curse." "And you believe it?" she asked, her voice soft, almost pleading. He closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he admitted, his voice laced with a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "But I know I don't want to spend it alone." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jiang Nian's heart ached for him, for the loneliness that echoed in his voice, the fear that haunted his eyes. In that moment, the complex web of their relationship shifted, the lines blurred between obligation and something more. And so, on his 30th birthday, a day steeped in fear and superstition, Qin Xiao received his first ever birthday celebration. A simple cake, a single candle flickering in the dim light of his study, and the quiet presence of a young woman who had become, in the strangest of circumstances, his unlikely savior. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared secret, their intertwined destinies. As the clock ticked past midnight, a silent agreement passed between them. A sacrifice made, a life saved, a future forever altered. In the quiet stillness of the night, the bargain was sealed, the marriage consummated, not with passion, but with a profound sense of shared vulnerability and an unspoken understanding that transcended the precarious implications of their choice. The future stretched before them, a vast, uncertain landscape shrouded in the shadows of their past and the fragile hope of a new beginning.